I was 29 that year, just trying to keep my head above water. The job I had at the time wasn't much. Warehouse work, stacking pallets and checking inventory late into the night, but it paid enough for rent and cheap food. I lived in a small town in southern Missouri, the kind of place with more closed-down storefronts than open ones, and I didn't have much tying me down. No girlfriend, no kids, not even a dog. Just long hours at work and longer hours trying to get some peace of mind. It was late October when I decided to take a few days off. I had some PTO I hadn't used in over a year, and my manager practically begged me to use it before the calendar reset. I didn't have money for a trip or hotel, but I had my gear from the year before. Tent, sleeping bag, small gas stove, and a few cans of food, still packed in a storage bin in my closet. I figured I'd go camping somewhere quiet and off the grid for a couple nights. I wanted to get away from fluorescent lights and diesel fumes, maybe clear my head. I didn't want a campground with picnic tables and running water. I wanted real quiet, so I went to the library the week before and looked through some old county maps. That's when I noticed a small area northeast of town labeled Whitaker Cemetery. There wasn't much on the map, just a cluster of trees, a faint trail, and a square with a cross inside. No roads leading straight there. I asked one of the older guys at work about it, and he said the place had been shut down for decades. He remembered his dad mentioning something about it being an old family cemetery from the early 1900s, maybe earlier. He said no one went there anymore. Said it was way back off some logging trail near the old Pinebrook Cut. That sounded perfect to me. No people, no traffic, no noise. I figured if I hiked in and set up camp somewhere near the edge, I'd have a quiet night or two before heading back. I wasn't trying to do anything weird or disrespectful. I didn't believe in spirits or anything like that. A graveyard was just land with some stones in the ground to me. I packed my bag on a Thursday morning and drove out past the limits of town until I found the logging trail. It wasn't maintained anymore, but it was passable enough if you didn't mind some brush scraping the sides of your truck. I parked about a mile from where the trail seemed to end and loaded my backpack. It took another hour on foot before I saw a break in the trees and the sloping rise of the cemetery ground. It wasn't much to look at, just uneven land covered in tall yellow grass, old iron fencing that was bent and rusted at every post, and maybe a dozen headstones poking out like jagged teeth. There was no gate, no sign. The place hadn't been touched in years. I set my tent up just outside the tree line, maybe 40 or 50 feet from the first row of stones. I could see them if I looked out from the flap, but I wasn't right on top of them either. I figured that was the respectful thing. I boiled some water, ate a bag of instant rice and beans, and sat on a log watching the sky turn purple behind the trees. There were no lights, no sound, just the crackle of a small fire I kept low. That first night wasn't bad. I heard some owls, maybe a coyote in the distance, but nothing out of place. I slept okay. Woke up early, stretched, drank instant coffee, and wandered the edge of the cemetery just to get a better look. The stones were old, most of them unreadable. A few had names and dates, mostly from the 1880s to the 1920s. A couple were broken in half. There were sunken spots in the ground where the earth had collapsed inward over time. There was something sobering about it. The people buried here had long been forgotten, their families probably gone or scattered. No flowers, no flags. Just crumbling granite surrounded by thick weeds and wild blackberry bramble. I spent the rest of that day exploring the woods. I followed a small dry creek bed for a couple miles, then circled back. I didn't bring my phone, wanted to unplug completely, so I used a compass and mental notes to navigate. I got back to camp by late afternoon and cooked again. I felt peaceful for the first time in a long while. That night, things started to shift. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up cold. I'd zipped the sleeping bag up tight before bed, so that surprised me. The temperature had dropped hard, colder than the forecast suggested. I could see my breath. The inside of the tent was quiet, No wind, no rustling. I figured it was just a cold snap and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard the crunching sound. It was faint but clear, like someone stepping on dry leaves or brittle grass. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, but it kept going, slow and deliberate. One step, pause. Another step, pause. I didn't move, just listened. The steps came closer. Then they stopped. I held my breath. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I didn't have a weapon, just a small camping hatchet I'd left by the fire ring. If it was a person out here, that didn't make sense. No one hikes into an abandoned cemetery in the middle of the night with no lights. After a few minutes, I unzipped the tent just a crack and looked out. Nothing. The trees were still. No movement. The fire was just smoldering coals. I stayed like that for a while, eyes adjusting to the dark, trying to catch any sign of motion. I thought about packing up and hiking back to the truck, but the idea of stumbling through the woods in the dark wasn't appealing either. Eventually, I zipped the tent shut and sat there with my knees up, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Probably an animal, maybe a deer that got spooked. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just cold and still. I made coffee and tried to shake it off. I walked a wide circle around the camp, looking for prints. I didn't see any. The ground was hard and dry, though. Would have been easy to miss something. Later that afternoon, I wandered deeper into the cemetery. Something about the place bothered me now. Not in a supernatural way, just the atmosphere had changed, like it was holding its breath. I found a part of the graveyard I hadn't noticed before. Past the main clearing, through a line of half-dead trees, there was a smaller section surrounded by low stones, almost like a family plot. The grass was thicker there, and the headstones smaller. Children, maybe. In the far corner, half covered by ivy, I found what looked like the remains of a small building. Stone foundation, some rotting timbers. Probably an old caretaker's shed or tool shack. I sat on one of the stones and tried to calm my nerves. I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just the isolation getting to me. That night would be better. But it wasn't. It was worse. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Same as before. Slow steps through dead grass. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. This time, it circled the tent. Not fast, just measured, deliberate. I stayed completely still. Then it stopped right at the front of the tent. I didn't dare unzip it. I waited and waited. Felt like forever. Then I heard something drag across the tent wall. A soft scratch, like a stick or a finger. It moved around to the back, then disappeared. I didn't sleep at all after that. Just sat there holding my breath, clutching a pocket knife that I knew wouldn't do much good. I wanted daylight. I wanted out. When the sun finally came up, I packed fast. I didn't even make coffee. I threw everything in the pack and didn't even roll the tent. Just stuffed it. I made it back to the truck in under 40 minutes. But I wasn't alone. About halfway down the logging trail, I saw something to the left, deep in the trees. A figure. I didn't stop to look closely, just saw the outline. Tall, still, watching. I drove out of there without stopping. Didn't breathe right until I hit pavement. That night, back in my apartment, I took a hot shower and sat on the couch with the lights on. I didn't feel better. I felt watched. I told myself it was a poacher or some crazy hermit, maybe even another camper who stumbled in and thought I was trespassing. But none of that really added up. I didn't go back to work right away. I called in sick for a few days and didn't leave the apartment. I kept the blinds shut and locked both deadbolts. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't tell anyone. A week later, I drove to the edge of town and found a small hardware store. I bought a trail cam, just one. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof. Maybe I just needed to know I wasn't losing it. That weekend, I drove back to the trail during daylight and hiked in just far enough to mount the camera facing the clearing near the cemetery. I didn't stay, didn't bring gear, just set the cam and left. I went back 3 days later to retrieve the SD card. The footage showed nothing at first, just wind in the trees, light shifting across the clearing. Then, at 2:41 a.m. on the second night, the motion sensor triggered. A figure stepped into frame. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way you'd expect. It was too thin. The posture was off. The head too low. The arms too long. It stood there for over 10 minutes, not moving. Then it stepped backward into the dark and was gone. I deleted the footage, formatted the card, threw the camera in a dumpster on the way home. I haven't gone camping since. I moved the following spring, took a job out of state, told people it was for better pay. They believed me. I still think about that cemetery, still see that shape in my dreams sometimes, but I never went back, and I never will. It was 2022, early October, and the cold rains had just started returning to the Pacific Northwest. I was 37, living in Vancouver, Washington, working from home in IT support. After months stuck indoors staring at a screen, I needed a break from all of it. My apartment, the noise, the slow churn of working from home that never really let you relax. I decided to head out for a weekend alone into Gifford Pinchot National Forest, not too far from Mount Adams. I'd been up there a few times when I was younger, but not for several years. This time I wanted complete solitude, no campgrounds, no other hikers, just quiet. I picked an old, barely used trail a friend told me about years ago called the Switchback Loop. It was technically still maintained, but barely. The ranger's office said the trail was clear but muddy and warned about early fall weather. That was fine with me. I packed a weatherproof tent, a tarp, cold weather sleeping bag, stove, dry food, my old Browning knife, and a revolver I kept mostly for peace of mind when camping alone. I drove out early Friday morning, reaching the trailhead around noon. It was already gray and cold. I parked just off a gravel forest road, locked my truck, hoisted my pack, and started hiking in. The trail cut deep into the forest, winding down into a valley, then gradually climbing back up. It had probably been a logging road once, long before it became a trail. The forest was thick, dense fir and pine, ferns climbing up mossy boulders, everything wet. I hiked for nearly 4 hours, not seeing a single soul. The trail got thinner and sloppier as I went. Around 4 p.m., I picked a spot a short way off the trail to make camp. A level clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a slight slope above me and a drop-off to the east. I was maybe 6 miles in. I set up the tent on a dry patch under the biggest pine, laid a tarp over it to keep out the coming rain, and gathered some downed branches for a small fire. Rain started falling lightly by the time I boiled water for a freeze-dried beef stew and ate with my gloves on. I was layered up, but the air already had that sharp edge that bites through gear if you stop moving too long. As it got dark, the forest turned pitch black. There was no moon, just low clouds. My headlamp only lit up the mist around me. I didn't hear anything unnatural, just wind and the occasional branch creaking. I crawled into the tent, zipped up, and lay listening to the rain hit the tarp above. The wind picked up after midnight, whistling low like someone blowing across a bottleneck. Took a while to fall asleep, but eventually I did. I woke up just after 3 a.m. The rain had gotten heavier. The air in the tent felt colder, even inside my sleeping bag. The wind had shifted direction and the tarp above was fluttering more now. I figured it was just the storm rolling in, but I felt uneasy. It wasn't the cold, it was something else. Something I couldn't place right away. A sensation, not a sound or sight. I lay there a few minutes, listening, trying to figure it out. Then I heard it. Not the wind, not a branch cracking. Something else. It was soft at first, faint steps far off. My mind wanted to write it off as an animal. Elk maybe, even a deer. But it didn't sound like that. The steps weren't panicked or fast. They were slow, deliberate, not on 4 legs but 2. They came from the slope above my tent. I sat up slowly inside my sleeping bag, not making noise, holding my breath. The steps paused, then moved again. Just a few more, crunching faintly through wet leaves. Whoever it was, they weren't using a light. If it had been another hiker, they'd have been lit up in that blackness. These steps came with no light at all. I waited a long time. The steps didn't come closer. I kept still, ears tuned, but all I could hear was the storm. No more movement. Eventually, I told myself it must have been a tree limb falling, or my nerves. I lay back down but didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the rain had eased to a drizzle. I got up stiff and sore, made coffee, and stood under the tarp trying to shake the anxiety. The forest looked the same as it had the day before. Quiet, mist curling through the trees, no tracks, nothing out of place. I hiked a short loop deeper up the trail with my day pack, mostly to shake the feeling. I found nothing. No other tents, no boot prints, no signs of anyone. When I got back to camp, I checked the slope above. The leaves were soaked, and the moss was too soft to hold real prints. But I swore I could see where something or someone had stepped across a cluster of ferns. I didn't touch them. I didn't want to know. I didn't leave though. I should have, but I didn't. Part of me still thought it was just paranoia. I stayed close to camp the rest of the day. The rain stayed steady. The wind died down in the evening, but the sky stayed dark. I ate early, didn't make a fire, just went straight into the tent around 7 and lay there with my sleeping bag zipped tight and my revolver next to me. At 11 p.m., I heard the steps again. This time they were closer. They came from the side, the direction of the trail, and stopped about 30 feet away. I could hear them clearer now. Not just the steps, but the way the weight shifted. It wasn't an animal. It was a person.
No flashlight. No gear.
No voice. Just slow, measured steps. Then stillness. I sat frozen inside the tent, holding the revolver against my leg. My chest thudded so loud I thought whoever it was could hear it through the rain. They stood there a long time. I thought about unzipping the tent to look, but I couldn't. I didn't want to see whoever it was, or whatever they were doing out there. Eventually, after what felt like half an hour, the steps moved again. Not toward me, away. They circled wide around the tent, back uphill toward the slope. Again, no light, no sound except boots against wet ground. They never ran, never rushed, just that steady, slow walk until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When the light finally started cutting through the trees around 6 a.m., I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The forest was gray and heavy with fog. My tarp had held. Everything looked normal except the ground. Just past the clearing, I found them footprints. Clear ones this time. Not animal. Not boot prints like mine. Flat-soled shoes, maybe hiking shoes or sneakers. They came in from the trail, stopped near a log, then walked in a wide arc behind my tent before vanishing toward the slope. I packed up in less than 15 minutes. I left everything I didn't need, firewood, trash, even one of my pans. I got the tent down, shoved it wet into the pack, and took off back down the trail the way I came in. The hike back took longer. I kept stopping. Every sound felt too sharp. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone on the trail. I didn't, but I knew they were out there, somewhere. I didn't know if they had followed me from the start or just stumbled on my camp, but they'd come back twice. No words, no light, no signs of camping, just a presence, steps in the dark. I reached my truck before noon, soaked and cold but alive. There were no signs anyone had tampered with it. I got in, locked the doors, and drove straight back to town without stopping. I didn't call the ranger. I didn't report anything. I didn't even tell my friend who first mentioned the trail. 2 weeks later, I read an online post from a hiker on a backcountry forum. He'd camped near Switchback Loop that same month, alone. He described the same thing. Steps outside his tent, no flashlight, no voice, no one ever showing themselves. He packed up at dawn and left early too. It wasn't just me. I've gone camping a few times since, but never alone, and never that deep without marked trails or neighbors nearby. I still think about that weekend more than I'd like. It's not just the fear. It's the way it all stayed just vague enough that I couldn't do anything about it. No confrontation, no words, just quiet steps in the dark, circling my tent, as if they knew I wouldn't come out, as if they'd done it before, and maybe they had. It was August 2016, and I had just turned 32. I remember that clearly because I bought myself a new tent and hiking boots as a birthday gift. I needed a break from everything: work, people, traffic, phones, and I decided to take a solo camping trip. I lived in Lexington, Kentucky, but I wanted to go somewhere more remote, somewhere less developed and far from campgrounds with trailers and kids riding bikes around. I chose the Daniel Boone National Forest, but not one of the usual hiking paths. I'd found a lesser-known trail on an old internet forum, and it looked perfect. It was way off the grid. I even had to use an offline topographical map app just to track it. I packed light, just enough for 3 nights. Tent, food, sleeping bag, knife, rope, flashlight, spare batteries, water purification tablets, a fire starter kit, a lighter, and my .38 revolver. I wasn't expecting any trouble, mostly brought the gun for snakes or maybe coyotes, but in the back of my mind, I always figured it was just smart to carry when you were going that deep into the woods. I parked my truck in a small gravel turnout just off a forestry service road. There wasn't another vehicle in sight. From there, I walked for a good 5 hours into the forest. The first few hours were on a marked trail, but then I veered off at a point where a split fork followed a dried creek bed. There was no one around. No footprints, no litter, no trail markers. Just trees, the soft crackle of leaves, and the distant whine of cicadas. That first night was calm. I set up my tent just before dusk near a ridge that sloped down into a little valley. I found a flat patch under some trees and made a small fire pit. I ate jerky and some trail mix, drank filtered water from a nearby creek, and lay back to listen to the forest. The stars were so clear it felt fake, like I was inside one of those planetarium domes. But that night I kept waking up, not to noises, not to animals, just waking. I felt off, not afraid, just uneasy. Couldn't put my finger on it. At one point, I thought I heard a stick crack somewhere to the north, maybe 100 feet off. But it was the woods, things snap all the time out there. The next day, I broke camp early and hiked further in. I wanted to find a good spot near water so I could catch fish and not rely so much on dried food. I found a slow-moving stream around mid-afternoon, with a rock overhang that provided some shade and a bit of shelter from wind. I set up camp there again, tent, fire pit, even hung a tarp between some trees to dry gear if needed. That night, things got strange. About an hour after sundown, I was tending my fire, just poking at it with a stick, when I noticed something strange in the trees across the stream. I could see the silhouettes of trunks and leaves, but behind one trunk, there was something darker. It was too wide to be part of the tree. For a while, I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. I stared at it for a long time, not blinking. Then it moved just slightly, enough that I knew it wasn't a tree. At first, I told myself it was a deer, maybe a black bear, but it wasn't shaped like an animal. It was upright. I never saw it walk or move clearly, but it disappeared after a few seconds like it had just stepped back into the woods. I sat there, still as I could, for almost half an hour after that, just listening. I didn't hear anything move. I didn't hear brush rustle or water splash. Nothing. I slept with my revolver next to my chest that night. The next morning, I found prints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Human. They were faint in the wet mud by the stream, just a couple of them, but they were definitely there. They weren't mine. I had worn hiking boots since I got out of the truck. These looked like they were from someone walking barefoot. The size looked average, maybe a man's foot. Chilled me. What kind of person walks barefoot this far out? I should have packed up then and headed out, but part of me was stubborn. I had planned for 3 nights, and this was only the second. I moved my camp a bit upstream, hoping that would be enough to put distance between me and whoever that was. That day, I didn't go far. I stayed close to the water and sharpened some sticks, made some noise on purpose, hoping if there was someone out there, they'd realize I wasn't a pushover. I built a larger fire that night and made sure to keep it going as late as possible. The woods were dead quiet around me.
No owls. No crickets.
Just the sound of water trickling downstream. At around midnight, I woke up in the tent to the sound of rocks clicking together. Not rolling, not shifting, clicking, like someone was knocking stones. Came from the direction of the stream. I lay still, heart pounding, listening. It happened again, a deliberate clack. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. Eventually, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. My fire had burned down, just glowing coals now. I didn't see anything by the water, but the feeling that someone had been there was strong. I got out and stoked the fire, made it big again, then sat with my back to the tent and kept watch. I never saw anyone, but I didn't sleep again. The first light, I broke camp. I had a terrible gut feeling, like I was being watched. I didn't even eat, just packed up and started back toward the truck. But here's the thing, I was careful about marking my trail. I had left subtle marks in the trees, used a digital compass, and followed the topography. But less than 2 hours into my hike, I started seeing things I didn't recognize. Trees I hadn't passed, a dead log that looked unfamiliar. At first, I figured I had drifted, so I adjusted and kept going. But the forest seemed different, subtly, but enough to notice. Then I found one of my own trail markers, but it was scratched out. The bark clawed or scraped so hard it looked like someone had tried to destroy the mark. I was going in circles. The panic crept in after that. I sat on a log, pulled out the map, rechecked my GPS app, tried to calm down. I thought maybe I had just panicked and misread my bearings. I chose a new direction and committed to it. I hiked another 3 hours in a straight line, uphill mostly, thinking I'd eventually hit a road or something recognizable. But instead, I found something else. It was a pile of bones. Animal bones, definitely, but they were arranged, not scattered. Arranged in a sort of crude circle, like ribs, spines, jaws, set out like some kind of display. I didn't linger to analyze it. I kept going. Eventually, around mid-afternoon, I stumbled onto what looked like a very old hunting blind, half collapsed, with a rusted metal chair inside. There were spent shell casings on the ground, long bleached from the sun. I knew then that I wasn't totally lost. Someone had been here at some point, but it also told me I was deeper in the woods than I had planned. As night came, I gave up on reaching the truck that day and made a cold camp with no fire. I ate quietly and barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I'd hear movement. Small crunches, twigs snapping, a distant breath. I gripped the revolver and didn't let go. The 4th day, I finally caught a break. I climbed a hill that opened up to a partial overlook. In the distance, I saw a utility line running through the trees. I knew if I could follow it, it'd eventually lead me to a road. I headed straight toward it. That line saved me. After following it for hours, Dehydrated and shaking, I came out to a gravel road. A forestry truck passed less than 30 minutes later. The guy gave me a long look, asked if I was okay, and I just nodded and said I'd gotten turned around. He didn't press it. When I got back to my truck, the driver's side mirror had been broken off. There were fresh scratches on the driver's side door, like someone had dragged a stone or blade along it in a slow, jagged line. Nothing else was touched. I never went back to that part of the forest. I never even reported it. I still camp, but not alone, and not without telling someone where I'm going. Looking back, I think the scariest part wasn't that someone was out there. It's that they never tried to talk, never asked for food, never confronted me. They just watched, walked barefoot, knew the forest better than I did, and followed me long enough to know where my truck was, what I'd marked, how to erase my way out. They weren't lost. They were home, and I was trespassing. I took a week off work in early September 2019. I was 34 at the time, working in a small machine shop in Sheffield. I was getting worn down by the noise, the heat, the constant need to keep production moving. It wasn't just the job either. My head was messy from a breakup that dragged on for months. I needed to clear out, and I figured a solo camping trip would help. Just a few days far away from anyone. I'd done it before and enjoyed the quiet. I picked a spot in Northumberland, near the Scottish border, about 3 hours' drive from where I lived. I found it on a forum, some guy talking about hiking trails near a place called Kielder Forest. Huge forest, quiet roads, no phone signal in most parts. Sounded perfect. I wasn't planning anything fancy, just tent camping, basic food, walking around during the day, reading, sleeping early. I wanted to be off-grid. I packed light. An old green tent, sleeping bag, clothes for cold nights, basic gear like a compass, flashlight, power bank, water tablets, knife, and a first aid kit. I also had a little foldable camp stove and tins of soup, beans, rice. Enough for 4 days. I filled up at a petrol station just past Hexham, turned off the main road, and drove into the forest. No reception from that point on. The first night was calm. I found a flat clearing about 15 minutes off a gravel road. The trees opened up just enough for light to come through. A stream ran nearby, and the ground was soft but dry. I pitched the tent, gathered some dry twigs for a small fire, and cooked up a tin of stew on the stove. Felt right. I didn't hear a single car or voice for hours. The only sound was the wind in the trees and water trickling from the stream. When it got dark, I read a few pages from a paperback, then went to sleep. The second day, I followed a trail that led deeper into the forest. It wasn't an official trail, just a worn-down path someone else had walked before. The kind you see but can't find on a map. I liked that. Felt like a place no one went anymore. After a couple of hours, I turned back, made some coffee near the tent, and sat watching the light through the leaves. Late that afternoon, I noticed something that felt off. It was just a sound at first, branches snapping, deeper in the trees, heavier than a deer. I stood still and waited, thinking it might be a boar or a big dog, but nothing came out. It stopped. I brushed it off. The forest has animals. You can't expect silence all the time. That night, though, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to the sound of something outside. It wasn't constant. It would happen, stop, then happen again a few minutes later. Slow, quiet movement. I thought maybe a fox or badger was sniffing around the food, even though I kept it sealed and away from the tent. In the morning, I found a few small footprints near the edge of the clearing. They weren't boot prints, just impressions in the soft dirt, maybe from bare feet. Could have been kids, I told myself. But I hadn't seen a single person in 2 days, not even a hiker in the distance. And what kid walks around barefoot in the forest? I almost packed up right then. Something about those prints made me feel exposed. But I didn't. I told myself I was being stupid. I checked my gear, made sure everything was in place, and took a short hike to a small ridge with a good view. I sat up there for hours trying to calm myself. When I got back to camp, nothing had changed, and I felt silly for getting worked up. But that third night, things changed for real. I didn't light a fire that night. Something in my gut told me not to. I sat inside the tent with the flap half open, looking out into the dark. I tried reading again but couldn't focus. Every now and then, I heard movement again, twigs breaking, leaves crunching. Not like an animal scurrying. Slower, deliberate. I turned off my headlamp and listened hard. It felt like someone was walking around the tent. Not close, maybe 30 or 40 feet out, keeping just far enough to be unseen. I gripped my knife and sat still for a long time. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, not the wind. Real breathing. Slow, shaky, like someone standing just beyond the trees, trying not to make a sound. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I stayed crouched in the corner of the tent, barely breathing myself. After a while, the sound faded, and the forest was still again. I stayed up the rest of the night, knife in hand, heart pounding. When the sun came up, I got out and checked the area. I found more prints, clearer this time. Bare feet, longer strides than the ones before. Whoever it was had walked in a half circle around my tent. Some of the prints had toes spread like they'd crept slowly. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. I left the spot as it was, didn't eat, didn't stop to fill water. I just walked fast toward where I thought the gravel road was. I didn't want to panic, but my brain was racing. No phone signal, no way to call anyone, no car nearby. I knew the forest was too big for anyone to hear me even if I screamed. After maybe 2 hours, I reached the road. I walked along it for another 30 minutes before finally reaching the levee where I'd parked my car. The relief I felt unlocking the door and sitting inside was like nothing I'd ever felt before. But before I started the engine, I noticed something. The back window had a smear on it, like a handprint dragged downward. Greasy, wide fingers. I stared at it, frozen. The car had been locked. The keys were in my pocket. Whoever it was, they had touched the car. I drove back in silence. Didn't turn on music. Didn't stop except once for petrol. When I got home, I took everything out of the car, cleaned it top to bottom, and threw out the tent. I didn't want to look at it ever again. I told a mate about it weeks later, just to get it off my chest. He said maybe it was just a hermit or someone living off-grid, someone who saw me as the intruder. Maybe, but I don't buy it. The way they moved, the way they didn't show themselves, the handprint on the window, that wasn't just someone passing through. That was someone watching, someone who didn't want to be seen. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, but I stick to marked trails, places with other people around. I learned that the quiet can hide things, and sometimes when you go looking for peace, you find something else instead. I was 34 years old the summer I decided to spend a weekend alone at the old farm. It was late July 2018. I'd been dealing with a divorce that left me feeling drained in ways I hadn't anticipated. The paperwork was done, the house had been sold, and everything was divided up and boxed away. I needed some time to think, not in the self-help book kind of way, more like I needed to just stop hearing the buzz of traffic, emails, or other people talking. Silence had started to sound like a privilege. I was tired. Not sleepy tired, just tired of people. The farm was in northern Missouri, around 30 miles outside Kirksville. My Uncle Jim used to own it. He passed away in 2011, and since then, the property had sat untouched. It was too remote and too old to be worth much, so it never got sold. Most of the fields were overgrown now, but the house, barn, and a couple of silos still stood. I packed my truck with some basic camping gear: a tent, food, my old hiking boots, a hatchet, and a rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but out in those parts, you didn't go wandering without something to deal with snakes, coyotes, or worse, people who didn't like visitors. I got to the property just after noon on a Friday. The gravel road that led to the gate was full of deep ruts, and the weeds on either side brushed against my mirrors. I stopped at the gate, unlatched the chain, and drove through. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I noticed how quiet it was. No cars.
No voices.
Not even wind. Just a hard, dry silence and the hum of insects. The house was leaning slightly. I didn't go inside. I knew raccoons and maybe worse had probably made a home in there. I pitched my tent in the clearing behind the barn, close to a dry creek bed. The trees offered some shade, and it was far enough from the house that I didn't have to see its crooked windows every time I looked up. I unpacked and set up camp: tent, chair, cooler, small fire pit. After that, I grabbed my water jug and walked the property for an hour or two. The fields were thick with waist-high grass and thorny bushes. A few rusted pieces of old farm equipment still stuck out of the ground: an old plow, a seed spreader, some iron piping. The silos were still standing, tall and silver with faded paint and vines creeping up their sides. The main barn was the only real structure still intact. I peeked inside and saw old hay bales, broken ladders, and nests in the rafters. I didn't linger. That first night passed quietly. I built a small fire, cooked a bit of meat over it, and drank a couple beers while watching the sky fade to black. I was thinking about how long it had been since I'd done something like this. Just sat in the dark and let the night come. No phone, no people, just the chirps and rustles of whatever lived out there. I slept with the tent flap open, letting the warm air drift in. Felt good. Until the second night. Saturday started like the day before. Hot, dry, a little boring. I did some reading, walked the edge of the tree line, and explored the old barn again. This time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Behind the barn, maybe 40 feet back, was an old structure I'd completely missed. It was smaller than the barn, more like a shed or an animal enclosure. The weeds were so tall around it that it looked like part of the land. It was mostly hidden behind one of the silos and a broken fence. I walked over and saw that it was built low to the ground, almost like a cellar. The wood was gray and weather-worn. A heavy padlock dangled from the latch, but it had long since rusted open. I bent down and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned like something waking up from sleep. Inside was dark. No windows, just a dirt floor and the smell of rot. I didn't go in. Not fully. I just looked around from the doorway. The structure went about 15 feet back, with low shelves on the walls and piles of something I couldn't identify in the far corner. I got a strange feeling in my chest, like pressure. I told myself it was the heat, but I backed out and let the door close without going any farther. That evening, I sat by the fire again. The sunset bled red through the trees, and the sky turned a sickly orange. The bugs were louder that night, like they were warning something. I didn't like how the barn looked in the dark, how the open mouth of the door seemed to stretch wider the longer I looked at it. Around 11 p.m., I crawled into the tent, zipped the flap shut, and lay back with my boots still on. I wasn't as calm as the night before. I kept hearing little things. Twigs cracking, dry grass moving, short, irregular sounds. Animal stuff, probably. I told myself I'd just gotten spooked by that little building out back. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up suddenly. Not because of a noise, but because of the silence. Everything had gone still.
No bugs. No breeze.
Just dead quiet. That kind of silence has weight. Presses on you like something is holding its breath nearby. I sat up and unzipped the tent flap a couple inches. The fire had burned down to coals, giving off a soft red glow. I scanned the clearing. Nothing moved, but something didn't feel right. I was about to lay back down when I saw something in the direction of the barn. A shape, not big, not small, just there, standing at the edge of the barn's open doorway. I stared at it for a long time, eyes watering in the dark. It didn't move, neither did I. Eventually I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, rifle across my lap, just listening. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally came up, I walked over to the barn. There were no footprints, just dust and dry straw. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That day, I didn't explore. I didn't eat much either. I stayed close to the tent, always with the rifle within arm's reach. I even walked to the truck to make sure it would still start. I didn't pack up though. I don't know why. Maybe I felt stupid for being afraid of a shadow. That night, I didn't build a fire. I wanted to stay hidden. I cooked quietly on my small camp stove and waited for dark. But something in me had changed. The stillness no longer felt peaceful, felt watchful. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard movement near the barn. This time it wasn't subtle. Something or someone was walking. Slow, deliberate steps on dry dirt. Then a sound like dragging. I grabbed the rifle and crept out of the tent. I stayed low and moved behind the cooler, scanning toward the barn. There was nothing, but I could hear it. Scraping sounds. Then a dull thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. Then silence again. I moved toward the barn, rifle raised. I didn't call out. I just approached, slow and steady. When I reached the doorway, I paused and listened. Nothing. Then I stepped inside. The air was stale and full of dust. I aimed the flashlight attached to my rifle toward the back of the barn. That's when I saw it. One of the bales of hay had been dragged into the center of the floor. There were marks in the dust, footprints. Fresh ones. Not boot prints, bare feet. The kind that left toe imprints. Small, like a child's, but spaced wide apart. I backed out slowly and returned to the tent. But I didn't go inside. I spent the entire night behind the truck, keeping my back to it and eyes on the barn. Morning broke and I didn't wait around. I packed up as fast as I could. Tent, cooler, rifle. I left the fire pit smoldering. As I drove back down the gravel road, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing next to the silo, but I didn't stop to check. A few days later, I returned with a buddy of mine who's a deputy in Macon County. We came back armed and in daylight. He didn't laugh when I told him what I'd seen. We checked the barn, the shed, the silo, everything. What we found still sticks with me. Inside the small structure behind the barn, the one I hadn't fully entered, we found bones. Animal bones mostly, but some looked strange. Small, too clean. We found cloth too, buried under hay. Rotted flannel, a shoe with no laces, and a rusted tin plate. Whoever or whatever had been living there had been doing so for a long time. My buddy didn't report it officially, just told me not to go back, and I didn't argue. I've never been back to that farm. It's probably still there, overgrown and forgotten, waiting behind a locked gate no one watches. I don't think it was haunted. I think someone had lived there, hiding in the silence, long enough to become part of it. That weekend was the first and last time I tried to get away like that. I learned something important: silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes, it's a sign that something nearby doesn't want to be found. I still think about the footprints in the dust, the dragging noise, the shape at the barn door. I tell myself it was some drifter, maybe a squatter, or a kid who wandered too far. I tell myself that because the alternative is worse, that someone was waiting, watching, and I was the one who brought the noise, the fire, the attention, and next time, they might not just watch. It was October of 2016, and I had just turned 33. I'd been feeling burnt out from my job as a mechanic in a small garage near Portsmouth, in southern England. I'd done nothing but work, sleep, and repeat. After my dad passed the year before, I hadn't really taken a proper break. That fall, I finally decided to take a few days off and go camping. Not with friends, not with family, just me. I figured it would be a good way to clear my head and get some quiet. I'd done a fair bit of hiking and camping before, so I wasn't worried about going alone. I chose a place I hadn't been to before, somewhere near the River Esk in Scotland, not far from a place called Langholm. It wasn't a big tourist destination, which was exactly why I chose it. I'd found an old trail online, mentioned on a bushcraft forum. It led a few miles along the river and into some lightly wooded hills. The guy who posted about it said he'd camped there twice, and both times he'd seen no one for days. That sounded perfect to me. I packed light but smart. A solid sleeping bag, my one-man tent, a gas stove, a torch, food and water for 4 days, and my old hunting knife. More for cooking and camp chores than anything else. I had a paper map too, because I didn't plan to rely on my phone once I was out of town. I'd leave the car in a small gravel lay-by I found on satellite images and walk in about 3 miles to a bend in the river. The drive took me the better part of the day. The last stretch was a narrow single-track road, barely used anymore, lined with mossy stone walls and low brush. I parked, locked up, and started walking around 3 in the afternoon. The air was cool and smelled like damp leaves. I remember thinking how nice it was to be away from everything. No engines, no phones ringing, just the crunch of my boots and the sound of the river. Took me just over an hour to get to the spot I'd marked on the map. A little rise above the riverbank, dry and flat, with a view of the water through the trees. I set up my tent and got a small fire going to boil water for tea. As the light faded, I sat with my back against a log, sipping from my metal cup and watching the steam rise. The quiet felt like a blanket. It was exactly what I needed. The first night passed without issue. I slept deeply. In the morning, I stretched, had a quick breakfast, and decided to follow the river upstream. I brought a small day pack with water, a snack, and the knife. It was more of a walk than a hike, mostly flat with patches of wet grass and tangled roots. I passed a few deer trails and some old fence posts that were long since broken and rotting. Around midday, I came across something odd. About 30 meters from the riverbank, just past a thicket of hawthorn, there was a very old, low stone wall. Most of it had collapsed, but there was one section still standing, maybe 2 meters high, 5 meters wide. Behind it were the remains of a structure, maybe a crofter's cottage from long ago. Just a few stone outlines left on the ground. I took a few steps inside the ruins, curious. There was nothing remarkable, just rocks, moss, and a few rusted bits of metal that might have been tools once. But I did notice boot prints in the mud nearby. Not mine. These were fresh, recent. Someone else had been here. That alone wasn't too strange, but what bothered me was how deep they were. The ground wasn't that soft. Whoever made them was heavy, or they'd stood still in one place for a long time. I followed them for a short way, but they stopped abruptly. Not like the person turned around. They just stopped. I stood there for a while, looking around. I didn't see or hear anyone. No voices, no rustling. Nothing. Still, something about it unsettled me. I walked back to camp more alert than before, glancing over my shoulder now and then. It was silly, probably, just another hiker passing through. But the air had a weight to it after that. Like the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watching. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I heard noises in the distance, snaps and crunches that I told myself were deer, but I kept reaching for my knife out of instinct. Around 2 in the morning, I sat up and unzipped the tent a bit to look out. Moonlight lit the trees in silver. I saw nothing moving, But I didn't go back to sleep until the sky began to lighten. The next day I debated hiking out, but part of me didn't want to let my nerves win. I told myself it was nothing, probably a farmer checking on land or an old trail user like me. I spent most of the day near camp, gathering firewood and sitting by the river. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the woods. Every time I looked directly, it was gone. Maybe it was wind in the branches. Maybe not. That evening, things escalated. I had just finished dinner, beans and sausage in a small tin pot, and was cleaning up when I noticed something about 20 feet from my tent. A small, smooth rock on top of a flat stump. I hadn't put it there. It hadn't been there earlier. It was a perfect oval, gray and flat, with a chip out of one side. I walked over and picked it up. Cold, dry. Someone had placed it there recently. I looked around, slowly turning in a circle. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I felt something deep in my gut tighten. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone was close, watching me. I packed my food back into my bag and stowed it properly. I made the fire a little larger, not out of comfort, but because I wanted the light. I kept my knife at my side. I didn't go to sleep. I sat there with my back to a tree, facing the tent and fire, eyes scanning the dark. At some point in the early morning, I must have nodded off. I woke with a start around dawn, cold and stiff, my neck sore from the position. The fire had died down to coals. I stood up, stretched, and froze. There were more rocks, 3 of them, lined up just outside the tent's front flap, perfectly spaced, small, the same type as before. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't touch them. I didn't move. I just packed everything up as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even refill my water. I started the hike out just after sunrise, and I kept checking over my shoulder the whole way. Nothing followed me. I didn't hear any sounds except birds and branches under my own boots. But the feeling didn't go away. The sense that I was being followed, watched. I got to the car and threw everything into the boot. As I turned the key and started the engine, I felt a wave of relief wash over me like a fever breaking. The road out felt longer than it should have, and I didn't feel safe until I was back on the main road, with signs and traffic and the noise of other people. When I got home, I unpacked and sat on the couch for hours, not turning on the TV, not moving much, just thinking, going over everything. I never found out who was out there, or what they wanted, but I've got theories. Maybe it was some local with mental issues, or someone living off-grid who didn't want people near. Maybe it was just some weird hermit messing with me. I don't know. I'll never know. But I've camped dozens of times before and since, and nothing has ever felt like that again. That wasn't just the woods being spooky. That was human, deliberate. I never went back to that area. I looked it up once the next year and found nothing. No mention of cabins, no private property warnings, nothing official. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Someone was out there, and they didn't want me around. And they weren't in a rush to show themselves. They just wanted me to know I wasn't alone. That was the scariest part. Not knowing what someone's planning, just knowing they're close and waiting. It was in the summer of 2013. I had just turned 31 and wanted to take a break from work. I was doing freelance carpentry at the time, mostly small jobs, decks, fences, a few attic conversions. It was the kind of work that kept my hands busy but let my mind rest, and it paid just enough for me to afford a small trip every year. That summer, I decided to go camping in France. Not the fancy kind of camping with electric hookups or Wi-Fi. I'm talking about real, off-the-map camping. I had been looking at the southern region near the Cévennes, a quiet area with rolling hills, oak forests, and trails that twisted through deep woods. I had no plans to hike far or see any tourist sites. I just wanted silence, a break from the hammering and drilling and talking. I flew into Marseille, rented a car, and drove inland. The weather was good, warm but not baking, clear skies, and the occasional cool breeze that drifted through the car windows. I had printed out a topographic map before I left, no GPS. I liked doing things the old way, and I had marked a few areas where the elevation dropped into a valley near a stream, places that looked quiet. I found a spot on the second day. A gravel trail led off a main road and disappeared into dense trees. I followed it for about 20 minutes until it faded into tall grass and brush. From there, I parked and walked the rest of the way in with my pack. I had my old canvas tent rolled and strapped on the top, 2 days worth of water, a small cooking stove, and some canned food. Nothing fancy, just the basics. I found a flat spot near a stream with tall trees on either side. The air smelled like moss and dirt. I could hear the water trickling over stones, and I didn't hear any cars or people. That was the most important thing. No voices, no sounds of traffic. Just wind, bugs, and birds. I set up the tent before dusk, gathered some dead wood for a small fire, and cooked a tin of beans. I didn't have a signal on my phone, but I wasn't worried. I had told my brother where I'd be, roughly, and we agreed I'd check in by text every 3 days. It felt good to be disconnected for once. The first night was uneventful. I stayed close to the fire and watched the stars. The trees above me made a sort of tunnel, so I had a narrow view of the sky, but it was enough. I fell asleep with the tent flaps open, just the screen zipped shut, listening to the steady rhythm of water on stone. The second day, I spent time hiking around, marking a few trees with small cuts in the bark so I wouldn't get turned around. I wasn't too deep into the woods, maybe a 45-minute walk from the road, but it was dense, and the forest floor was uneven. You could get lost fast if you weren't paying attention. That evening, I cooked again and was finishing a cigarette when I heard something snap in the distance. It wasn't an animal. I know the sound of deer hooves on twigs. This was a footstep, someone stepping on a branch. I froze and listened. Nothing followed. No rustling, no continued movement. Just one distinct snap from deep in the woods. I stood quietly, hand on my knife. Not because I thought I'd need it, just instinct. I kept waiting to hear more, but it didn't come. Eventually, I sat back down and told myself it was just a branch falling. Trees drop limbs all the time. Maybe it was a boar or something stepping wrong. Still, I kept the fire going longer than usual that night. It wasn't fear exactly, just that itchy feeling at the base of your neck, like something unseen is watching. I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up, not from sounds, but from this weird, tense energy in the air, like when you're waiting for someone to knock on the door, but they never do. The next morning, I walked a bit further into the woods than before. I found a narrow animal trail that led up a ridge and looked down over the stream where my tent was. From that height, I could see the white of the canvas tucked between the trees. That's when I noticed something odd. There were faint prints in the dirt near the ridge. Not fresh, maybe a day or two old, but they weren't mine. Too wide, too far apart. It looked like someone had walked along the ridge and paused to look down toward my camp. There were no boot treads, no deep sole pattern, just the smooth outline of shoes, leather or something flat-soled. I crouched and stared at them for a long time. It's not illegal to walk through the woods in France, and this wasn't private land. But the way the prints stopped there, directly in line with my tent, that wasn't random. Whoever it was, they had stood up there and looked down at my camp. Maybe just passing through, maybe curious. But I hadn't seen or heard anyone in 2 days, and the place I chose was far off the trail. You had to know where to go. I didn't hike any further that day. I stayed near camp, sharpening my hatchet and keeping my ears open. I stopped smoking that day too. Didn't want the smell or glow attracting anyone. That evening, I built a smaller fire and kept it low, just enough to boil water. I ate cold food after that, not wanting the smell of cooked meat in the air. I slept with the hatchet next to my sleeping bag. In the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't just a weird feeling. There was a soft thump outside. Not close, but not far either. I lay still and listened. Came again, like someone stepping on moss. The kind of sound you wouldn't hear unless the woods were dead silent. I didn't move for an hour. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I packed up early. I thought about hiking further in to lose whoever might be watching, but that felt stupid. I wasn't trying to play games in the woods. I just wanted to leave. But when I got to where I left the car, something made me stop cold. There was a plastic bottle resting on my hood. It was one of those cheap water bottles, dented and dirty. It hadn't been there when I parked 2 days earlier. The cap was off and the label had peeled halfway. It wasn't threatening in itself, just odd. Why leave it on the hood? Why not throw it or leave it on the ground? It was placed, not dropped. That's when I knew. Someone had found my car. Someone had followed me in. I looked around the clearing. Nothing moved. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, and the tall grass made soft whispering sounds. But I didn't see anyone. Still, I felt it again, that tight pressure at the back of my neck. That invisible stare you can't explain. I drove out fast, heading for the nearest small town. It was about an hour away. I didn't stop until I found a little parking lot behind a bakery. I just sat there, gripping the wheel, watching the mirrors. I stayed in a cheap motel that night. Tiny room, hard bed, no air conditioning, but it was heaven. For walls, a lock, a ceiling. I could breathe again. The next day, I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone left a bottle on my car, and I heard footsteps. It wasn't illegal, and besides, nothing had happened. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was stolen, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It had followed me back, clung to me like smoke. Still, I didn't want to end the trip on a bad note. So after a few days in town, I drove to a national park farther north. A proper campground this time. Gravel pads, other tents nearby. Families, kids laughing. It wasn't wild, but it felt safe. I stayed there 4 more days. No strange sounds. No prints in the dirt. No bottles on the hood. I tried to convince myself I'd overreacted. Maybe it had been a coincidence. Maybe the footsteps were animals. The prints old. The bottle from someone lost in the woods. That worked mostly until the last night. I was sitting at a picnic table near my tent, writing in a notebook, when a guy walked by on the gravel road. Tall, thin, long arms. He wore a green canvas jacket and dark pants. He didn't have a backpack or any gear, just walked slowly past, looking at each campsite in turn. He didn't stop, didn't talk, just looked. His eyes passed over mine for a second. Flat and empty. I didn't move. He kept walking, disappearing around the bend. I waited a long time. Then I packed everything and slept in the car. The next morning, I left France. I haven't camped since. Even now, years later, I think about that man in the woods. The one who stood on the ridge. The one who followed me to the car. I don't know if it was the same man I saw in the campground or if I was just paranoid by then. I'll never know. But I learned something on that trip. Something real. People can be scarier than anything else out there. You can plan for bears or storms or getting lost. But you can't plan for a quiet man watching you from the trees. And once you feel that stare, you never really forget it.